Good morning, you guys. Hello. I don't know if you guys have checked your Blackboard in the last 24 hours or so. I posted an announcement for you with 3 links. One of the hazards of giving an assignment that is to some degree current is that things can happen that might be relevant to your assignment. So you might have noticed yesterday in your copious spare time that the Supreme Court made a non-decision on the issue of gay marriage. I believe 5, perhaps 6 states, including Indiana, appealed to the Supreme Court to overturn lower federal court rulings on gay marriage so that they could continue, the states could continue to prohibit it. And the Supreme Court refused to act other than to return the issue to the lower federal courts that had already ruled against the states. So this has implications for expanding the number of states where gay marriage is or will be now legal. And if you go to those links, you'll find 3 relatively short articles that explain the significance of the decision by the court. I'm not saying you have to incorporate that in your papers that are due later this week. I'm simply saying that I felt an obligation to let you know about what happened so that you can at least consider it as you finalize and work on your papers.
Hey, Mr. Ellison, I've got a question about the paper.
Yes, please go ahead.
So my last name starts with A, and so I know I'm supposed to write about the legalization of gay marriage and the people.
I'm not hearing you too well.
My last name starts with A, so I know I'm supposed to write about the legalization of gay marriage and the people that brought about that change, but I'm not sure how I'm supposed to relate it to federalism or what that question is asking.
Okay, so here's what I would recommend that you do. I mean, this is what I would do, I think, if I were, I mean, this is a hard paper, okay? Parts of it are easy, and then, but I'm not asking about the easy part, I'm asking about the hard part. What I would probably do is create a spreadsheet. And you have a certain number of states, either that have legalized or prohibited gay marriage. And you have 3 levels of government, that is local, state, and federal, and most of the action would just be state and federal. And then you have 3 different branches of actors, legislative, judicial, and executive branches at each level. And then you have what might be called non-governmental or extra-governmental actors who have tried to influence the policy one way or the other. Various kinds of social movements, interest groups, and so on. And so what I would do is take, if I were writing the paper, is I would take each state and I would start to fill in the spreadsheet of the actors involved who did whatever it was that was relevant to you, whether it was supporting or opposing, depending on which part of the alphabet you're in, so that you have then a spreadsheet of all the actors, whether judicial, legislative, or executive branch at either the state or non-governmental actors, and then at the state level and at the federal level for each state. And then what I would probably do, because obviously you don't have time in your paper to go down state by state and describe each of 19 or 30 or however many states. So then I think you need to look for patterns. What's the most dominant pattern of either opposition or support? How did it happen? Who were the critical actors more often than not? Okay? And the relationship to federal, so then once you have the actors, whether they're state actors, non-governmental actors, or federal actors, then what you have to grapple with is the issue that I raised in the first paragraph of the assignment, and that's also discussed in the text. And that is federalism, does federalism and do states facilitate or block political change? And it's not an either-or answer. In other words, the right answer is both, okay? And so what I'm asking you guys to do is one group to look at how it facilitated political change and how that happened, and another group how it prohibited change or blocked change. And so the argument in politics tends to be, American politics tends to be that on the one hand, the states are kind of like laboratories for political experiment and policy initiatives, because it's hard to get something through the Congress, especially now. But if you can get something changed at the state level, then you can experiment with it and see how it works. And if it works well, then everybody is going to know about it, and other states are going to want to do the same thing. Okay? So that's the argument for that's the argument that states can facilitate political change. The argument against it, one of the primary arguments against, well, there are two primary arguments against it. One is that local and state elites become so dominant that political change is impossible. For example, the political culture of Mississippi makes change very difficult. The dominance of the Mormon religion in Utah guarantees that it's a very politically conservative state. The influence of oil and the oil business in Oklahoma makes it is so powerful that the state legislature recently passed a law that said if you use solar to heat your house, you have to pay a fine. You have to pay an additional fee because it undermines the ability of energy companies to get money and sell their services. I know that, to me, that sounds bizarre, but what it does is reflect the power of the energy businesses in Oklahoma. So that's one argument about how states prevent political change. The other argument is that if you have to go make political change by going state by state, that takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. It's really hard. Okay? You got to go to 50 states. But if you go to the national government, if you go to Congress, you only got to win once, not 50 times. And you don't need the level of personnel or money to be able to make political change through, at least in theory, through the Congress. And so there are these two arguments, sets of arguments really, about political change and the federal system, which is essentially, what role do the states play in either obstructing or facilitating change? And so what I try to do is say, okay, both of these arguments can be right, and so let's look at an issue where there's been significant political change, and let's try to understand it. How did this happen? Who made it happen? Or who kept it from happening? And so that's how the question of political change is related to the question of federalism. My bias, personally, is that it's easier to go through, in most cases, to go through Congress. I would give you one example. The Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment passed with 2/3 majorities in the Congress of the United States, both bodies. And to me, there's nothing at all that's even remotely controversial about the Equal Rights Amendment. But 3/4 of the state legislatures would not ratify it. They got close, but they didn't get 3/4. So that's an example of I mean, if 3/4 of the states couldn't even agree that women ought to have equal rights and equal protection under the Constitution of the United States, then, you know, it's going to be hard to even pass an amendment that says there's 7 days in a week. That's my point of view. And so there's ammunition, there's good arguments on both sides. So what I was trying to do with the assignment is to have students look at, some students look at the states where there was change and others where there wasn't, and then just describe and explain what happened in each. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So this is not about whether gay marriage is good, bad, or in between. That's not the assignment. Okay? It's a matter of who is involved in either making or obstructing political change around this particular issue at the state level and the federal level. Any other comments? Is that clear enough?
I have another question.
Go ahead.
I already have to change my report some because of the 5 states that have now been added to it. But
I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time hearing. Go ahead. Start again.
One sec. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. What if the 6 other states, which are in limbo right now, get added, say, Wednesday? Would we have to add those to our report last minute, or would it be all right if those weren't included?
I guess what I would do is, first of all, the easy thing about the Supreme Court action yesterday is that they were all states that were opposed and who appealed a lower federal court ruling overturning the state law or constitution, whichever. And essentially the Supreme Court, by not taking any action, endorsed implicitly the action by the lower federal court. So what you can do is you can treat those 5 or 6 states as a block. One of them, by the way, was Indiana. You can say a couple things about them. First, you can say they wanted to uphold their opposition. So I think the burden in this particular case, in terms of inclusion, falls more on those who are writing about the states where gay marriage has been opposed or prohibited. Okay, and actually, it falls equally on both. But it's all of a piece. You can say for those who are writing about the states where it's permitted, you can say, okay, a key actor was, one of the key actors was the Supreme Court compelling, based on lower federal court rulings, the states to begin to recognize under the law gay marriage. For those who are writing about those who are the states that are where it's been prohibited, you can say the states took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The state attorney general, presumably the state governor, were still opposed, and in fact, the governor of Oklahoma has come out and said that the court's decision was wrong. Okay, the governor of Utah has said, well, I don't like it, but I'll enforce the law. And so you can just write briefly that actor. You already knew that the lower federal courts had made a decision, so really all you need to do is say, okay, for those, what this does is confirm that the states, 5 or 6 states, were really committed to prohibiting this.
Okay. Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, I don't even think a paragraph is necessary. Maybe a sentence or two, three at the most. If you leave it out, it's not a catastrophe, but I think it's easy enough to include, and one of the reasons it's important is because it's not just one state, it's 5 or 6 states. Let me make one other point about this. And that is, this doesn't mean that the issue is over. You might recall that one of my unique definitions of democracy in the United States is that we're a political system where nothing is ever finally settled, or almost nothing is ever finally settled. So some observers have said, look, the reason that the Supreme Court returned the cases to the lower federal courts rather than issue a ruling or take up the cases and then issue a ruling was that there hasn't been a clear-cut disagreement in rulings between different lower-level federal courts, and that the Supreme Court in this issue might be waiting for a conflict in rulings between lower-level federal courts and then take up the case, that conflict, and then resolve it. Okay? So just because the Supreme Court didn't act in this particular appeal by 5 or 6 states doesn't mean that it will never take up the issue. It means that the issue has not crystallized in terms of judicial ruling conflicts in lower federal level courts. I know that seems kind of, it seems kind of arcane in a way, but I mean, it's the court. Keep in mind, the court gets thousands of appeals every year, and they only rule on, maybe 1%, maybe 2%, if that. So anything they can do to weed stuff out, they'll do it. And they'll wait for a case that they think is more appropriate. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, what time is it due on Thursday?
Well, anytime the end of the day is fine. If it goes into Friday, given this new action, if you need another day to kind of incorporate and to figure out how you're going to incorporate this new information, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
That way it won't ruin you. If it's in by Friday, it won't ruin your weekend.
Yeah.
We'll let another instructor ruin your weekend. Other questions? Next time, don't wait so long to ask them. Ask early. You guys should not adopt the essay writing or the paper writing philosophy of my son, who in college said that acted in the following manner. He said, as long as I have 45 minutes to write a paper, I have plenty of time. Bad idea. Although it turns out that might have been very good training for his profession. He's a copywriter, so he's got to write stuff quick. Okay, any other comments? Okay. Thank you. I want to finish up. We only have about 3-4 more slides. We finished up last time talking about political language and showing George Carlin. I hope I introduced you to a comedian that you will like, and even though he's known by people who are 20 and 30 years older than you, more so than you guys, you'll find that he's rather funny and often on point. The point of showing you that piece was I wanted to suggest that, which I think he does, is that political language itself is a form of socialization. that often obscures or misinforms about political life. I mean, we have a wonderful example before us now, which is, from my point of view, which is the case of Ebola. I've never met anybody, I doubt you've met anybody who ever had Ebola. Yeah, Ebola is, a horrible disease. More people are killed by guns every year than in the United States than Ebola, and it's not even close. More people are killed in traffic accidents every year, year after year after year, and nobody raises an eyebrow about it. And here we have this, tremendous environment of fear that around this disease, which is a dreadful disease, but which can't exactly be passed around just by looking at somebody. Okay, it's not an airborne disease. The other example is a recent example is ISIS and ISIL in the Middle East, where Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham from South Carolina, goes on television and says, on the Sunday morning talk show, and says, "They're going to kill us all." Well, that's just fear-mongering. It's ridiculous. They're driving around, deserts or virtual deserts with, in pickup trucks and with equipment largely taken from the Iraqi army that we gave the Iraqi army. So there are lots of different narratives in contemporary political discourse. One of them is fear. There are many others as well. And it's important to, deconstruct. It's important to try to not just accept what people say at face value, and to ask yourself what's really being said here, and what's the justification or evidence for it. So, what Carlin, of course, was trying to do was to show how people in office try to obscure exactly what's going on. Any comments? Okay, very briefly then, we want to finish up, and the last slide will not be too brief, unfortunately, but it's important, and so we'll get there. So one of the things that people in public life do is they frame the agenda, and they frame how they talk about it, and they frame policy issues. Some agenda setting pushes some issues off of the policy agenda or the political agenda, and it also puts some on front and center. Framing is a way that people in political life try to frame or to interpret what an issue means, how we should look at it. One of the things that we know about democracy is that there's supposed to be a relationship, not maybe a perfect one, but a decent relationship between public opinion and policy, or policy making. And what political science research shows is that sometimes governments are responsive and sometimes they're not, but that public opinion can set limits on what governments do and don't do. One of the reasons, we're going to come back to this when we talk about Congress, so I'm not going to spend any time on it right now. One of the reasons responsiveness may be weak is that every 10 years, the state legislatures and maybe other political office holders, sometimes even courts in states, redistrict their congressional districts. And in doing so, most states have a propensity to create what are known as safe seats. And so one of the things that we know is that incumbents in the Congress get reelected usually more than 90% of the time. So if the odds are 9 or 10 to 1 that an incumbent in the House of Representatives or in the Senate is going to be reelected, why would they need to listen to anybody? Incumbency is a powerful political advantage. This is one of the reasons Some folks argue for term limits. I think it's a bad idea myself, but we'll talk about that later when we talk about Congress. So there are reasons why policymaking very often doesn't fit very nicely with or isn't particularly representative of public opinion. And it's because of the way we elect and re-elect the same people. And there is research also that shows that more competitive elections tends to create members of Congress who are more attuned to and representative of public opinion, and that those who are in safe seats are much less so. So just to recapitulate, then we talked about public opinion as a set of attitudes and ideas about the nation and government and political affairs, and that opinions tend to fluctuate over time, but the political culture, the assumptions, the values, the customs, the habits that we use to give meaning to and understand political life tend to be more deeply rooted. And when they're really deeply rooted, they are often ideologies. And what I want to do here very briefly is do something impossible. I want to briefly, at least briefly for me, describe 4 different political ideologies that are relevant in the American political context, and do so with 2 major caveats. First of all, there is no unity. There is no unity of opinion in any of these 4 ideological narratives. There is a diversity of opinion among liberals, among libertarians, among conservatives, and among socialists. To argue that there is kind of one thing and everybody believes it within that ideological rubric is simply wrong. One of the reasons is you've got different issue dimensions, which are down at the bottom of the slide. So there's foreign policy, there are domestic policies, economic policies, social welfare, environmental policies, and so on. There's civil liberties and civil rights, and there's social welfare programs and equity issues. So when political scientists look at the representativeness of political officials and political ideologies, they tend to break down the different areas of policy into these 4 domains. And so if it were just one domain, then it would be easier for there to be a greater unity within these 4 liberal ideological narratives, but in fact they are there. And the text also suggests that there are that there are differences within the different quote-unquote ideologies, but I would like to at least suggest to you what I think some of the main ideas, very briefly. By no means is this comprehensive. This isn't even the icing on the cake. This is just a teeny little bit of what these 4 ideologies involve. First, liberalism. Liberalism in the modern American context is traced back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, and it holds the view that while the framers argued that governmental power must be restrained and limited, modern American liberalism also holds that it's important to limit and regulate all forms of concentrated power, including the concentrated power of corporations. And that secondly, in so doing, the federal government can act to improve the lives of the American people. Libertarians hold the view that almost all of the decisions in our society should be made in markets and by individuals, not by governments, and that the fewer decisions that are made by governments, the freer we're going to be. Conservatives tend to hold to a belief in order and tradition, especially more traditional conservatives. They tend to argue, some argue, that government should regulate morals and social behavior. They tend to prefer the use of military force as an instrument of foreign policy. They tend to prefer lower spending and lower taxes, reduced governmental actions, reduced governmental services, especially with respect to domestic policy like economic policy, environmental policy, and social welfare policy. Socialism is, again, it's not a unity at all, but the central elements in socialism, it seems to me, at least in the American context, come down to two fundamental points, which are very general. One is that there should be governmental and democratic, with a small d, control of the most critical and necessary segments of our economy, and that secondly, governmental policy should act to limit social and economic inequality of all kinds. So I realize this is very brief, don't take it as any kind of exhaustive or comprehensive description, but only the barest minimalist description of these four political ideologies, but in the context of discussing political culture and political and public opinion and attitudes, I have to mention them at least briefly. But again, it's just not even the tip of the iceberg. Comments and questions at this time? Okay, so what I need to do then is move us into a discussion of interest groups. And in order to do that, I need to find what we're doing here. I need to open another PowerPoint. So bear with me a second. So this discussion of interest groups is kind of divided into two. The first is a relatively traditional discussion of interest groups and the literature on interest groups. And the second half, which we certainly won't get to today, is a description of how interest groups have changed in part as a consequence of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in 2010. Can you guys see this new PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. So if you want to read really important work on American political culture, you look at the work of the French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to this country, about 180 years ago, and wrote a very important two-volume work on American social and cultural life. And one of the things Tocqueville argued is that Americans, more so than most peoples, develop and sustain over time the principle of association. Americans join together, he said, to solve civic problems. They establish social relations, that they represent various economic and political interests, and that most Americans are part of one or more groups, and that this is a good thing. It's a good thing because it involves us in civic affairs. It's a good thing because if we privatize our existence, he said, and we come, and this is what he thought was one of the dangers of equality. If we think that each of us is equal or the same, then why do I need to participate in politics? I'll go drink my beer and eat Cheetos and watch Sunday football. And, of course, none of that was going on then, but you get my point. And let somebody else do it, since it really doesn't matter who participates and who doesn't, because we're all the same. In fact, what political scientists have found that more than 2/3 of all of us belong to at least one group, and we may not even know it. We obviously belong to one or another gender group, one or another age group, one or another demographic group, but we also belong to organizations. You know, whether it's the Future Farmers of America or AAA or a religious organization or any number of other groups. So, in fact, this led in American political science after World War II to a redefinition of and a new understanding of American political life that we referred to in an earlier class called pluralism. And the idea behind pluralism is that our country politically, socially and politically, is a huge, has huge numbers of now I got problems. Hang on a second. A huge conglomerate of many different interests and interest groups. I don't know how to. Lacey, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
I'll try and see if I can do it. I need to figure out a way to. Now I just got, okay, so let's see if this will work. Okay.
Yeah,
I think I figured it out, I'm fine.
Okay.
So the first thing I want to do is attack or critique some of the dominant narratives and understandings about interest groups. And I want to do so by pointing out that a lot of people say, geez, we just ought to get rid of interest groups. And my response to that is, you know what? There are a lot of groups that form in our country. And that interest groups are, in fact, even though we may not like a lot of interest groups, that interest groups are one way American citizens petition their government. It's one way they organize politically to try to accomplish something through public life. And so, while we may like some interest groups and not like other interest groups, if you were to abolish all interest groups, I don't see how you have anything remotely resembling democratic government, small d. Okay, so some of the narratives that are out there. Interest groups are special interests. Okay? Usually what that means is the interest groups that represent me are really good, and the interest groups I don't like are special. So when political officials use the term special interests, and they use it all the time, what they're really saying is some interests are good and I like them, and others are bad. Well, on the basis of what? That's the question. Further, another narrative is that interest groups corrupt public officials. They corrupt members of Congress. They corrupt governmental institutions, usually by giving them lots of money for political campaigns. Well, there's an assumption there, which is that people get elected to Congress and they're wonderful human beings. They're people of total integrity. Their values are just like the values of everybody else, and then they go to Washington and they are, they succumb to the interest groups and the lobbyists and so on. And candidates from both parties use that. It's Not that it's totally false. Do some political officials use many years in public office to enrich themselves in one way or another, usually legal, but maybe not ethical? Yes. Does it mean that they've been corrupted by these nefarious outside special interests? I'm not buying it. Another narrative is interest groups are just folks like the rest of us. No, they're not. They're different. They're different, and I'll explain in a bit how they're different. Another narrative, big money groups always win. No, they don't always win. They often win. They don't always win, because money is not the only resource in politics, and it's not always the most effective resource in politics. It depends. Often it is, not always. Interest groups just try to advance and protect their interests like everybody else. No, they try to get favorable government policy that will enable them to not only advance and protect their interests now, but in the future as well. Anyone can be an active part of an interest group. Well, that's pretty much true, but some interests may not have the resources to organize effectively. You might remember an earlier class I mentioned that I was a bit perplexed, I still am, that Latinos have not been able to organize politically as effectively as I think their numbers allow. And this is true, I think, even though they tend to reside in very politically important states, at least with regard to presidential politics. So just because there are a large number of you, it doesn't mean that you can organize effectively. I'll give you another example. Smokers. How easy do you think it is for smokers to organize politically, say, as opposed to the tobacco manufacturers? There's obviously a huge difference. There are only a handful of tobacco manufacturers, but there's tens of millions of people who smoke. But it's hard to organize. It's always harder to organize consumers than it is manufacturers. Another narrative, minorities, poor people, and illegal immigrants get excessive federal benefits at the expense of the white majority. This is just, let me just say, it's counterintuitive, okay? The reason why is that minorities, poor people, and illegal immigrants are among the disadvantaged groups who lack the resources and political power to support, to give support to, and especially re-election support and campaign money support to those who are running for office. So the idea that people with few, if any, political resources comparatively are able to systematically benefit more than everybody else from the political system just makes no sense. Makes no sense at all. It's just totally counterintuitive. Bureaucracies, their political support to bureaucracies doesn't help. Their political support to candidates, except for votes, does not help. And then there are conspiracy theories. The communists are taking over the government. The bankers in Wall Street rule government. The Jews in Hollywood and the media rule government. Gays are seeking special privileges. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories of these bad, awful people. More recently, it's Sharia law that is going to be imposed on the United States. It's just, all of this is just so much ridiculousness. So this will be the final slide for today. The best book ever written about American politics, I think I've already mentioned. It's by E.E. Schachtschneider. It's a mouthful of a name, I know. His book is called The Semi-Sovereign People, and he wrote, among other things, about interest group politics. And his argument was simply that interest group politics
didn't say 201 this time. Thank you.
His argument basically was that interest group politics has an upper class bias, simply because wealthier and advantaged people in our society have a wide array of resources, including time, that are unavailable routinely to most Americans. They also tend to have some important and what for them are important and compelling interests that they want to advance. And many Americans, maybe even most Americans, aren't too interested in politics or the intricacies of public policy. So we'll stop for here and right here, and we'll pick up next time. If you have any last questions on your paper, give me a phone call. See you tomorrow.
The connection. I mean, as far as what connection speed, are you going to be staying? Yeah, it's probably going to be, you probably want to just choose wireless. Are you? Okay, and so it's the first week of December? Okay. Okay, I'm just going to add that to my calendar to make sure that I'm there to back you up. Okay. Okay, cool. I'm jealous. Totally jealous. Oh, yeah. That's a, well, like I said, I've only done it one other time, and it took us quite a while to figure it out. There were 3 of us working on it, so thank you so much. Is it under C for collaborate?